What is up, everyone? It's Brandon coming at you live from Smith's Grove, and today I'm going to be kicking off a series of movie franchise reviews and retrospectives. What better way to kick it off than to start with my absolute favorite franchise of all time, Halloween. I mean, my channel name is basically dedicated to Halloween. It's a play on my name and a very famous side of the franchise. So, let's go ahead and get started with 1978's John Carpenter's Halloween.
I can't believe this. I can't tell you anything. Every time I tell you something, everybody else knows about it. No, mad.
To start it off, we're looking at 1978's Halloween, directed by John Carpenter. So way back when Irwin Yablans had an idea for a very simple premise and a name for a movie. It was going to take place on Halloween, and it's going to be a serial killer basically stalking babysitters. And after seeing Assault on Precinct 13, he sought out John Carpenter to help make this movie. So John Carpenter, with Deborah Hill, co-wrote and produced what would become a timeless classic. With a small budget of $320,000 and a limited tight-knit crew, Halloween was filmed in just 20 days in May of 1978. Tommy Lee Wallace, who I'll discuss more in a later video, was hired as a production designer. As everyone is already well aware, he purchased the Captain Kirk mask for like $1.98. It was under $2, I'm pretty sure. He grabbed a couple other masks, one being an Emmett Kelly mask, and I think maybe a Spock mask. After a quick half-hour, 45-minute session of modifications, out came the scariest and probably the most iconic mask of all time. Another guy that was brought on was cinematographer Dean Cundy, who would eventually go on to work on more films like Jurassic Park, Twister, Back to the Future, pretty much anything you loved in the 80s, 90s. This dude was involved in a lot of John Carpenter films, Steven Spielberg films. Very, very awesome cinematographer, responsible for some of the biggest movies that you'll probably love. Between John Carpenter and Deborah Hill, with their screenplay and their score, that John Carpenter wrote in 3 days, and despite not being able to write a note, did this in 3 days. Amazing. Wallace with his production design, his scout locations, and Dean Cundy with the new Panaglide technology and all the lighting turned what could have been just a mediocre thriller or horror movie into a absolute timeless masterpiece. It also launched a subgenre of slasher movies full of tropes and cliches that were never intended, as well as a number of sequels and reboots, and I'll be covering all of those on this channel eventually over the next coming weeks and months, for good or bad. Now, with all that out of the way, let's take a look inside the Sanitarium at John Carpenter's Halloween. The movie opens up with a pumpkin, a title card, and a theme so epic that it's been burned into not only our brains, but our very culture forever. We get an opening POV shot at the house filmed, and this was filmed using the previously mentioned Panaglide Steadicam. And looking through the window at a couple horny teens just doing what they do, they take it upstairs, decide they can't wait any longer. Through the door extends Deborah Hill's hand, reaching for a large-ass butcher knife. As she heads it, wait, that dude's done already? I've heard of one pump chump, but that's wild, bro. That dude needs some hymns or something. The POV then heads upstairs, putting on a clown mask from the hall, and then enters the room of a fully boobed out lady brushing her hair with the door just wide open. For her transgressions, the POV heads into the room unannounced and surprises the babe, in which she reveals that the POV is named Michael, as he stabs her repeatedly with the knife in true psycho fashion. He then heads downstairs and outside to a couple that pulls up and unmasks him, revealing him to be just a boy. I won't be covering the made-for-TV scenes in this video. I might do it in a different video. I do think they're worth checking out, though, in case you want that kind of completionist feel if you haven't seen them already. I think if you watch 1 and 2 as a package, you already kind of understand the sister-brother thing. It's kind of nice to have. I mean, it's just something different. But they're totally unnecessary and not needed for the experience of either 1 or 2. But I think if you like both, it's a nice package. Just my personal taste. Every now and then it's nice to go back and watch them, but I think checking them out's worth it if you haven't already. We fast forward 15 years, and Dr. Loomis, played by the amazing Donald Pleasance, is heading towards Smith's Grove Sanitarium alongside Nurse Marion Chambers, played by Nancy Stevens. He's already bringing some masterful acting to the front line here, as he explains that he never wants what he refers to as it loose But because his feelings aren't law, the law says Michael needs to be transferred. As they drive up to the front gate, they notice all the inmates are in the front lawn, and the concerned look grows on his face as he runs to the gate. Gate looks clearly damaged, it's raining. While out of the car, Michael jumps on top of the car and torments Marion a little bit, reaches for her. She escapes just in time for Michael to lunge in the car like some Tommy Vercetti shit, and then takes off into the night as Dr. Loomis cries out some classic lines.
He's gone from here. The evil is gone.
The next morning in Haddonfield, it's Halloween, and the final girl, Lori, played by Jamie Lee Curtis in her first big role, is heading towards school when her dad tells her to not forget to drop the key off at the Myers house. On her walk, she's greeted by an annoying little shit named Tommy Doyle, who's played by Brian Andrews. And you'll find out throughout the film that he's absolutely scared to death of the boogeyman that these kid bullies tease him about in school. And as luck would have it, she's dropping off the key at said boogeyman's house right now. Not realizing that they're being watched, they part ways and the innocent Lori walks off singing a tune Jamie Lee Curtis improvised on set.
I wish I had you all alone, just the two of us.
Back at Smith's Grove, Dr. Wynn, who will make an appearance later in the franchise, is walking out with Loomis, basically blaming him and still at the same time not believing that Michael's going to do all this damage and get all the way to Haddonfield. Loomis then mocks him and the staff for possibly teaching Michael how to drive and lets him know that he's heading to Haddonfield. Later in class, Lori notices a shapely figure staring at her outside, and as Lori's distracted by the teacher, it gives time for Michael to do that creepy little disappearing act he likes to do so much. On Loomis's way to Haddonfield, he stops to notify the police of what could be coming. He notices an abandoned tow truck nearby, but he finds a gown hanging from the door and a pack of matches earlier used by Nurse Marion. He takes off, though, without noticing the poor truck driver all naked and bloody in the bushes around the corner. After school, Lori walks home with Annie and Linda. Annie's played by Nancy Loomis, and Linda's played by PJ Souls. It's here that you really learn the complex nature of the main characters. Lori is the smartiest of the smarties. Linda is the totaliest of the totalies. And Annie, well, she's the bitchiest of the bitches. In true bitch form, she screams at the boogiest of boogeymen for driving way too fast. Before Michael decides to get out and totally lose his size 12 up or you-know-what, he lets cooler heads prevail and drives off. You know, knowing what comes later, I doubt Annie made any kind of phone calls.
And I'm glad I called that guy.
A few minutes later, after Linda breaks away, we see Michael staring from the end of a hedge bush. And when Annie goes to give him a piece of her mind, he's gone again. Up in her room, Lori goes to close the window in an iconic shot where we see Michael staring at her from in between the sheets, if you know what I'm saying. He pulls some boogeyman magic and disappears right in front of her, leaving her freaked out and questioning her own sanity. Meanwhile, Loomis makes it to Haddonfield finally. He stops by the cemetery where the caretaker starts to tell him a tale about a similar experience in Russellville about a man named Charlie Bowles. A fun fact here, actually, the comic book Halloween Night Dance actually touches on this story about Charlie Bowles in Russellville, and I think it, like, what happens. And one of these days I'm hoping to cover that and the other comic books, because some of them are pretty interesting with some cool stories. Before he can finish his tale, however, Loomis cuts him off and they realize they're standing right in front of what would be Judith Myers' burial site. Looks like the headstone's been removed, and Loomis was right all along.
He came home.
Annie picks Lori up heading to their respective babysitting locales, which are, as fate would have it, right across the street from each other. Past the time they start smoking the devil's lettuce and listen to a little Blue Oyster Cult, right before noticing that Annie's dad, Sheriff Lee Brackett, played by Charles Cyphers, was standing outside a hardware store where apparently it was robbed. The girls pull up and talk to the sheriff for a moment. He tells them the store was broken into and the thief took some knives, a rope, and a Halloween mask, blaming it all on those pesky kids. Apparently he doesn't smell the cigarette weed coming from the car either. It makes me question how good of a cop he actually is. And believe it or not, those out there who might question this, back in the day, if you're old enough to remember, drugstores, hardware stores, there were mom and pop shops in these small towns. They sold a little bit of everything. So Halloween masks, Halloween costumes, a little bit of everything, all included. Just as they drive off, Loomis approaches Sheriff Brackett, and in hilarious fashion, Michael ends up driving right past Loomis behind him in pursuit of the girls. Two things have always kind of bothered me about this part of the movie. One is how Sheriff Brackett and the other cops were still working on this theft that late into the day. The alarm was still sounding. Michael had obviously had that mask earlier in the day. I'm pretty sure he had it when Lori dropped off the key in the morning time. So if he would have got the mask and all, he would have got all the other stuff at the same time too. knew he stole all that together. See what I'm saying? So it's kind of hard to believe, but you try not to think too much into it. The second thing is how fast it got dark from the time they left that hardware store to the time they got to the Doyle and Wallace's house. It was pitch dark. The sun wasn't down that far when they left. It can't be that big of a town, right? It's a small town. Even if it was across town in the fall, things just don't get that dark that quick. I don't want to go too much further into it. It's something you don't really need to think too much about, I guess. It is a very small budget film, and it's still amazing for that. It just doesn't take me really out of the film or anything. Just one of those things that's always stood out. Anyway, the night comes and the girls have landed at their babysitting spots alongside Michael, who has just unlocked peak stalker mode. A little after, Loomis and Brackett roll up on the old Myers house to see what they can find. We get a really good scene here, and we get the true sense of how scared and serious the good doctor is.
6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes.
He's good.
The girls get settled in their babysitting duties. Annie is hatching a plan already, and Laurie is telling Tommy what an absolute suckfest his comic book collection is. Oh god, eat shit, Tommy. When Annie calls Laurie to tell her the good news and that she's set up Laurie on a date with Ben Tramer, who Laurie had a crush on, we'll hear more about Benjamin Tramer in the next video, and oh man, it is glorious, I promise you. While Laurie is pleading with Annie to call it off because she's a goody-goody, Tommy notices the shape outside the Wallace house doing his best TLC impression. This is actually one of my favorite shots in the film. It really captures the essence of what the creators were trying to do here. The lighting, the wide shot, the silhouette of the shape. It's absolute perfection. Tommy runs to get Laurie. Laurie comes back only to find, looking out the window, that Michael is gone again. After a round of stalking and a round of barking from Lester, Michael kills Lester because apparently he hates the good boys, and it seems to be something he does on the reg in this series. Meanwhile, Annie devises a plan to get her boy toy Paul over for a play session and takes Lindsay Wallace, played by Kylie Richards, over to the Doyle house to be watched by Laurie, who is a little reluctant at first.
You watch her, I'll consider talking to Ben Tramer in the morning.
Nothing like some good old blackmail.
Girl Scout comes through again.
After a cat and mouse setup and a little struggle, Michael slips Annie some cold steel in the back of the old 77 Monte Carlo. No music or anything, Mikey? Back at the Myers house, Dr. Loomis is waiting for a boy like you to return, as the kids that bullied Tommy earlier in the movie showed up daring each other to walk up to the door. Dr. Loomis being a dick to him. Hilarious! Another thing that makes this movie work is that little haunted house subplot that they've included. Every small town in America has a house or a building of some kind where someone was hurt or killed, murdered, or, maybe the local kids say it's haunted in some way because of that murder, or a witch lives there or something. We all have those, and it's relatable, and it's very timeless. Linda and Bob show up to the Wallace house to party, not realizing the house is empty. Well, all except Michael Myers, that is, who's doing a little creep show on them. They immediately get their freak on, only to take it upstairs for another short session of the sex. He lasted longer than the dude at the beginning, which, come to think of it, probably has a legit problem. I mean, we can all relate to Bob, though, am I right? Right? Bob says, "I'll be right back," as he heads down to get a beer, thus breaking a future horror movie trope that was unintentionally created by this film. After grabbing a couple beers from the fridge for him and the totally annoying chick that he left upstairs, Bob hears a noise and thinks it's Annie or Paul just playing a trick on him, when in fact, it's just Michael who gives him a real treat, popping out and giving us one of the best scenes in the movie. After killing Bob, Michael makes his way upstairs and has his sights on Linda. He pretends to be Bob under a bedsheet, and when Linda can't get his ghost, she turns his back on him to call Laurie. Michael then strangles Linda with what we would call the telephone cord, to some of the most orgasmic acting in the entire movie. Damn, Bob, even she didn't moan like that when you gave her the dirty. Just after, Loomis, still at the Myers house, turns and somehow just now notices the car from Smith's Grove and starts running down the road. Again, I'm not trying to think into this too much, because if you really do, it kind of messes with you a little bit. I mean, between the placement of the houses and the car where he actually left the car in front of the Doyle house or the Wallace house, it's kind of hard to determine where everything's actually located. Now Laurie, having heard the distress on the phone call, decides she's going to check things out across the street, and this sets up a nice little sequence and slow build for the final girl circuit. She finds Annie's body and Judith's headstone on the bed, backs in the closet where Bob is hung upside down and Linda's choked out, titty out, making some goofy ass faces. Laurie, now distraught, backs in the hallway against another door opening where the Boogeyman is slowly revealed in the background, and in another one of my favorite shots of this entire film. The light here was put on a dimmer to get the proper effect, and I'd say it worked extremely well. He steps out to slash her only to graze her arm, sending her over the edge of the staircase and down to the first floor, and now one of the most infamous, intense horror movie chase scenes can begin with another amazing shot of Michael atop the staircase looking down at Laurie. Laurie tries to escape through the front door only for it to be locked. She runs to the back, makes her way to the back door, and has to actually break out the glass just to get through, and she makes it back to the Doyle house with Michael in slow pursuit. After a brief tense scene and some struggle, she gets Tommy to wake up and make his way down to open the door just in time. After sending them upstairs, she realizes the window is open and starts to panic. At that point, she realizes he could be inside. She grabs a sewing needle and sits on the floor in front of the couch, where Michael then pops out and plunges the knife right into the cushion of the couch, missing Laurie in the process. She fires back quickly with the needle, stabbing him in the neck. Michael collapses and Laurie heads upstairs to tell the kids she's killed the boogeyman. Unfortunately for her, Tommy tells her you can't kill the boogeyman, and we get another cool shot. The kids lock themselves into one room and Laurie goes in the other room and locks herself into the closet by tying a wired clothes hanger around the knobs. Michael, after a few seconds, bursts through the closet door. She uses another clothes hanger to stab Michael in the eye. He drops his knife and she grabs it and plants it right into his chest, seemingly killing him for good. After that, she lets the kids out and tells them to go down the street to the neighbors to call the police. This is a line she uses actually later a couple times in the series. As Laurie sits there and rests, Michael does his best Undertaker impression and sits up. The kids run out screaming just as Loomis walks by and he puts two and two together. Back upstairs, Michael starts stalking towards Laurie. Michael catches Laurie through the door and starts to strangle her. As Laurie is struggling, she manages to get Michael's mask off just as Dr. Loomis makes his way up the stairs. Michael, who seems to be more into killing people with the mask on, decides to make it a priority, takes the mask and puts it back on his head. Just as he gets it back on, Loomis fires his gun, hitting Michael. Michael stumbles back into the bedroom and stands there as Loomis steps in and fires 5 more shots at him. Just in case you didn't know how many times he was shot, Loomis will be sure to remind you in the next movie. Michael falls off the balcony of the house after getting shot 6 times, and Loomis checks on Laurie with another great line.
What's the boogeyman?
As a matter of fact, it was.
Loomis goes to the window to check on Michael, and Michael is gone. As the theme plays, location shots replay, and heavy breathing ensues, and the credits roll. And that was John Carpenter's Halloween, released in 1978, and is one of the highest grossing independent films of all time. The movie took a few weeks to catch on in theaters, but after word of mouth had spread, it took off like wildfire, and has now become one of the most influential and probably best horror movies of all time. Millions will still watch this movie every year on Halloween, and many of us, like myself, watch it multiple times a year. One last thing I want to say about this is, you can almost always praise it for how sophisticated it is most of the time. It's definitely not a perfect film, but just the way it was shot, the characters themselves and the storytelling, they weren't all dumb red shirts that just made clear mistakes. They weren't just there to get killed, you know. It's before that trope really started. So, I mean, these characters weren't just doing stupid things, and they weren't just there to get killed, necessarily. They had a purpose. It was very lean, and that's one thing that was so successful about the film. And another thing I want to say is that it does really well. It puts you in that position. Yeah, you care about Laurie, you back Laurie, you want to be behind Laurie, you're rooting for, right? But more than that, I think you're rooting for yourself, because you can almost put yourself in that position as her, right? You've replaced her with yourself and what you would do, or you almost imagine what it would be like had you been in that closet, right? So that's one thing that it does really, really well. And I think that that's what makes this movie a cut above the rest. See what I did there? So Halloween 78 gets a rating of 4.5 out of 5 for me, as once again, not only my favorite horror film, but it's one of my favorite films of all time. Halloween 2, which still holds a special place in my heart, will get covered in my next video. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.